I'm going to start with a Tom Main quote from his book, Combinatory Urbanism. The complex interplay of human and natural forces shaping cities today and into the future demands that architecture give form to urban forces active beyond traditional building and property lines, and also that large-scale planning assume more flexible and adaptive spatial structures that are capable of accommodating the unpredictable, which is traditionally associated with architecture. If we are to adapt to these historically unprecedented changes in thinking and practice, new design concepts and methods must be created. And so the hypothesis I'm going to put in front of you today is that essentially that the suburbs are not some general market creation. The market certainly has had things to do with them, but the market has been heavily warped by a set of subsidies. One of the fundamental premises of the book is not whether someone should live in the suburbs or not. I believe in free choice. The question is whether we should pay them to do it. Subsidies are an interesting thing to talk about in this country. Turns out most Americans do not believe that they're subsidized. Turns out most Americans are in fact subsidized. In the meanwhile, we ignore a lot of very true costs. When we think about a gallon of gasoline, for instance, many economists from both sides of the political spectrum actually think that in addition to that $4 you pay for that gallon of gas and that Cadillac Escalade, that there's another $6 of societal cost in terms of depressed land values, congestion costs, pollution costs that aren't actually charged. And that's true, of course, of mass transit as well, but we hear about the mass transit societal costs all the time. The subsidy is going to cost X or Y or Z, but we never really talk about it in terms of gasoline and compare the two. And when you compare the two, you almost always find out that the cost of gasoline is more. In this case, the guy who drives the Escalade, Sam, finally realizes this, dumps his Escalade, and meets Louisa on the trolley, and he has a much happier existence. The subsidy regime, as I said, started after World War II. One of the biggest pieces of it was the National Highway Act. But that entire subsidy regime that started with that highway system then led to a series of other subsidies within the system, including a massive amount of money that we put into highways as opposed to any other form of transportation in the country, including planes, trains, and subways. And then you add annual federal energy subsidies, and the oil and gas industry, again, far outweighs the amount of subsidy that goes towards anything, especially clean energy, when you hear about all of the drama over Solyndra and all of that. This is a drop in the bucket compared to what the oil and gas industry receives. And then the big whammy of it all, the largest subsidy in the entire federal system, the mortgage interest deduction. If you're interested in building urban affordable housing, you get the stuff in the green, right? In other words, in terms of how much money the government actually invests in affordable housing, it's these crumbs that they throw on the table that everyone gets to wrestle with in terms of creating urban affordability, because this is where most of our government housing dollars go. Now, people will say, well, if you take the mortgage interest deduction away, the entire housing market would collapse, right? People wouldn't buy homes anymore. The problem is the data doesn't support that. The data says that whether you have a mortgage interest deduction or not, we in the Netherlands do, Canada, UK, Australia does not, you'll see that you have largely the same level of home ownership, because largely, if people want to buy a home, they buy a home. So what's totally missing, even in the progressive conversation, even at the most sort of basic pop culture scale, is this notion that density matters. This is a picture I took taking off out of Narita Airport in Tokyo, and this is a typical Japanese farming village where the houses cluster together. There isn't the madness of the Jeffersonian grid of every farmer out on their own. Right? The infrastructure is all tied together. So it isn't just about big cities. It's about that there's an inherent efficiency to us living as a society with land around us and this kind of difference between density and no building at all. And as Tom said, you can do fairly simple math, and it is at about 25 units per acre, which is not Manhattan by any stretch. It's roughly about Brownstone, Brooklyn, right, where if everyone lived at that density, yes, we could all fit in Texas at 7 billion people. The point is that I don't think we so much have a crisis of land as much as a crisis of imagination. And so what I find really fascinating is I walk around in planning circles and architecture circles, and everyone says, well, the world is urbanizing. The world is urbanizing. The world is urbanizing. There's more people living in cities than there are in rural areas, except the world isn't urbanizing. It's suburbanizing. Whenever you go anywhere in this world, this is what you see. It's a tumorous cancer. One of the scariest things I ever did was take a low-flying flight over Riyadh and saw what basically you see outside of Phoenix, which is suburban subdivisions in the desert. And when you think about the air conditioning and the irrigation and everything that's associated with it, this is our most lethal export. And if you read books like Fareed Zakaria's The Post-American World, and you understand that there are 2 billion people careening towards middle-class lifestyles, right? That if they try to emulate the lifestyle that we have in the United States, we simply do not have the resources to support that, no matter how many windmills and solar panels we put on our houses. Say you accept cities are better in terms of the economy, the environment, and public health and joy. Well, then how do you do it? Where do you go from there? Well, the first thing I would love to touch upon in terms of that is this density question. And this question of whether you can build density in conjunction with what I like to call civic delight or civic joy. Now, of course, the stereotype of hyperdensity is this: the wall buildings of Hong Kong, the traffic jams of Sao Paulo. And you know, what I tried to do very specifically in the book is define density and define this term hyperdensity as density that's 30 units per acre is above. And the reason for that is 30 units per acre is what you need to support rapid mass transit, not just a bus, but rapid mass transit, some form of rail-based transit to provide the ridership from that. Only 12% of the zoned land of all in the United States is zoned high enough to support rapid mass transit. I find this staggering, right? So the fact is that if you look at most of the zoning is actually down-zoned to a point where you can't even support mass transit in terms of ridership because of the zoning. This, of course, has led to higher housing costs and a variety of problems across the country. Now, there are some who say, well, then the solution is to densify suburbia. But the problem, again, is if the litmus test is, do you have to drive to get a quart of milk? How dense are you going to make suburbia? There's also this obsession with this notion of low-rise, high-density. Well, what's interesting about that, of course, is if you look at most low-rise, high-density environments, they're filled with rich people. I mean, how many young people look at Paris and look at the riots outside of Paris? Paris is probably the most segregated modern environment we have on the planet today in terms of a sort of functioning metropolis. How many people look to that and say, that's a model for the future? And I think it's very important for all of us as architects, planners, et cetera, to not somehow disassociate the urban form from what happens in that place, because it's not disassociated. And one of the things that you see in that area, that you see in, I think, the most interesting cities that you go to, is not just this plain pancake of height, but actually the highs and lows that are of any great rich city. And London is one of those places where you actually really see that kind of density. And so, you know, this is one of the things that worries me about contemporary planning practice, that it's become a bit too dogmatic. You know, Tom, I was just reading this article. Tom's on the cover of Architect magazine, and it says the Colossus, right? And it lists his height as 6'4". So he's 6'4". He's up here. You know, I'm down here. My wife's Greek. She's a little short. But you know, the funny thing is, we all hang around together. It's okay. You can put the tall stuff next to the short stuff. And everyone still kind of interacts, and it's okay. And so to me, this notion of a high-low city, where you could essentially create an upzoning, but allow highs and lows, peaks and valleys that would occur through the natural exchange of air rights in a marketplace, to me would be a much more interesting experience, a la London, a la areas around the High Line, and so forth. And so to me, it's not about mindless density that's still auto-oriented, but again, this hyperdensity that's centered on this notion of what I call an infrastructure of opportunity. We usually think of infrastructure as the systems that move things, move people, move electricity, move sewage, move water. I like to think of infrastructure in a broader way as an infrastructure of opportunity. So that includes schools and parks and medical care, all the things that actually provide urban dwellers with the ability to move up and be socially mobile. We have a great tradition of building infrastructure in this country, from the Erie Canal all the way out to Tennessee Valley Authority and so forth. But then you see this dramatic fall off. Again, after the Federal Highway Act, you see in real dollar terms about $2.2 trillion in the loss of infrastructure since about the 1950s. And one of the things that's interesting is that is an overlay of the continental United States on China. And when Japan started high-speed rail, people said, oh, well, high-speed rail will work in these small countries, but you clearly see a very large country taking this on in a very significant way. And what's interesting is if you look at that corridor right there in the mid-Atlantic, that essentially you could get from downtown Atlanta to downtown New York City in 3 hours at the same speed as the Chinese Harmony train, right? Now, this would change the way we all live, right? If you look, and there are 36 passenger flights a day from the 3 New York airports to Philadelphia. And I would submit to you that that is utter madness. And so it's extremely important that we figure out how to get this right, how to recapture this free time, how to recapture it for the environment, and get away from this notion that we're going to do this without subsidies. I mean, we're going to beat up the rail system because it takes subsidies, as if airlines don't take subsidies, as if cars don't require massive subsidies. We have to figure out a way to create equilibrium in this conversation. We in a city like New York have a very significant affordability problem, and that's not news to any of you. What's interesting is to get down into the nitty-gritty of what defines affordability. And affordability is 30% of your pay, and 70% is supposed to go to everything else. If you look at that metric, actually what you find is that there's been a 40% loss of affordable housing nationwide, really since 1960. And what I mean by that is not just the loss of government subsidized housing, but the loss of market rate housing that falls into that definition of 30% affordability. And so we have to unpack why housing costs as much as it does. Well, there's 3 components to the cost of housing: the cost of land, the cost of construction, and the cost of financing. The cost of land is heavily, heavily influenced by density, meaning that as you break out of wood frame construction is fairly cheap per unit, but as you get into higher densities, you can amortize the cost of that land over significantly more density. This is our country today, and I would argue that, again, that we simply don't talk enough about the way we live in the country. That somehow, if you listen to politicians speak, that the way we live somehow has nothing to do with the problems that we have. And how could that possibly be? Where we could actually end up with a country that's a much greener country, a much more prosperous country, a much more equitable country in terms of social mobility. I believe this can be done, again, in the developed parts of the United States. This isn't about new tracts of land, but actually looking at, and this is happening in some ways, looking at these areas that are outside of our major cities and the notion that we could live a much more compact lifestyle. We got to the current national landscape of the United States in about 50 years, and again, through this set of subsidies. I would argue that in that same 50 years, we can unwind it. It's sort of like quitting smoking, and the tumor drops. And so my last slide, this is my mascot. It's the real estate program at Columbia, Tom, that's in the architecture school. And when I started, someone said to me, well, isn't this the fox in the hen house? And I thought to myself, what a horrible metaphor for everyone involved. You either get to be a fox that goes around killing the hens, or you get to be a hen, which ain't so great, right? And so the hens were the architects and the planners and the community people. They're all the victims of real estate. And so I thought, well, you know, this is a terrible thing. We shouldn't think about the world this way. We should think about the world in a different way, where maybe what we should be teaching our students to be is both. In the sense that, you know, maybe it's good for students to have that kind of intelligence of the fox, right? That kind of steadfastness of the fox, but tied to the kind of productivity of the hen, that fecund, non-linear nature of running around, trying things, which is in many ways the iterative process of architecture till you finally lay an egg. But the idea that if we could merge those two, that we could create a new kind of professional for a new kind of environment in terms of the problems we now face in the 21st century. So that's what we're trying to do at school. I think it's what we're trying to do at SHOP as well. And so I have a lot of hope for this. I have a lot of hope for the way different architects and planners are thinking about it and writing about it. So I'll close on that. Thank you very much for your attention.